2:15 in the afternoon. The Persian Gulf. An Iranian F-14 Tomcat was already screaming through the thin air at 24,000 feet. Below it, a defenseless American KC-135 refueling tanker flew a track it had completed 1,000 times before. Today was different. The Iranian pilot was not performing a routine intercept. He was hunting. What followed would be a test of nerves that nearly ignited a theater-wide conflict. The sky over the Gulf was a vast and empty blue. The heat from the desert below created a shimmering haze that blurred the horizon where the water met the sand. The air was thin and freezing at high altitude. Inside the American tanker, the four engines maintained a low and rhythmic drone. It was a sound that usually meant safety and routine. Captain Sarah Miller looked out of the side window. She was a veteran with over 3,000 hours in the air. Her mission today was to provide fuel to a pair of patrolling fighters. But those fighters were late. They were currently refueling on the deck of an aircraft carrier 100 miles to the south. Captain Miller spoke to her co-pilot over the internal communication system. "How is our position?" The co-pilot looked at the navigation display. "We are exactly on the line. We have 3 miles of buffer before the restricted zone." "Stay on it," Miller said. "I do not want to give them an excuse." Behind them, the tanker held 48,000 kilograms of jet fuel. It was a flying bomb. If a single spark reached those tanks, the aircraft would vanish in less than a second. There would be no time for a distress call. 50 miles to the north, Major Abbas Rezai felt the vibration of his own engines. His F-14 Tomcat was a relic of a different era, but it was still a formidable interceptor. The jet was heavy and powerful. It carried a suite of long-range missiles designed to kill at distances far beyond the human eye can see. Major Rezai was not a hothead. He was a professional. He had been trained to defend his airspace with absolute resolve. Today, the political tension between Washington and Tehran had reached a boiling point. The rules of engagement had been rewritten in the last hour. The major spoke to his backseat officer. "Update on the target." The weapons systems officer checked his screen. "Target is steady at 26,000 feet. Airspeed is 400 knots. It is the tanker. Call sign, Exxon 51. "Are they across the line?" Rezai asked. "They are on the edge," the officer replied. "But our new orders say the edge is close enough." Rezai reached for the throttle. He pushed it forward. The two massive engines behind him roared as they consumed more fuel. The aircraft surged forward. He began to climb. He wanted the altitude advantage. He wanted to look down on his prey. Inside the tanker, the atmosphere changed instantly. A sharp and rhythmic chirping sound filled the cockpit. It was the radar warning receiver. It was the sound of a search radar sweeping across their metal skin. The co-pilot gripped the flight controls. "We have a hit. Someone is looking at us. High and fast to the north." Miller did not hesitate. "Exxon 51 to Qatar Center. We are being painted by a military radar. We are in neutral airspace. Please advise." The radio remained silent for 4 seconds. When the controller finally spoke, his voice was tight with stress. "Exxon 51. We see him. An Iranian Tomcat just climbed out of Bandar Abbas. He is moving toward you at Mach 1.2. Miller looked at the fuel gauges. They were heavy. They were slow. They had no way to outrun a supersonic fighter. The afternoon was still quiet. It would not stay that way. 2:20 in the afternoon. The Persian Gulf. The sound in the cockpit changed. The intermittent chirp of the radar warning receiver became a steady, high-pitched pulse. It was a physical weight in the small space of the flight deck. Captain Miller felt the hair on her arms stand up. "He is in single-target track," the co-pilot said. His voice was an octave higher than it had been a minute ago. He did not look away from the digital display. A search radar was a handshake in the dark. A track radar was a hand reaching for a weapon. Captain Miller gripped the yoke with both hands. She felt the massive weight of the 48,000 kilograms of fuel behind her. It felt like a target painted on her back. "Exxon 51 to Qatar Center," Miller said. Her voice was flat and professional. "We are in a single target track. Confirm we are in international airspace." The response from the ground controller was immediate. "Exxon 51. You are 12 miles south of the Iranian maritime border. We are attempting to contact the Iranian station at Bandar Abbas. Miller looked at the co-pilot. He knows where we are. This is not a mistake. 30 miles away, Major Rezai watched the green diamond on his head-up display. It was centered perfectly on the lumbering tanker. His radar intercept officer spoke over the intercom from the seat behind him. "Lock is solid," the officer said. "Range is 25 miles. We are closing at 600 knots. Airspeed is Mach 0.95. Rezai looked at the master arm switch on his console. It was currently in the safe position. He had spent his entire career preparing for a moment like this. He was a defender of his nation. To him, the American tanker was a massive gas station for the fighters that patrolled his borders. If the tanker was gone, the fighters would have to go home. "Maintain the lock," Rezai ordered. "We need to show them the line has moved. They think they can park on our doorstep." He knew the Americans were watching. Their satellites and their carrier strike group were recording every electronic emission. This was a message written in microwave energy. He wanted them to feel the heat. In the back of the American tanker, the boom operator sat in his glass-walled pod. He looked through the rear window into the blinding glare of the afternoon sun. "Ma'am," the boom operator said over the radio, "I have a contrail, high at our 6 o'clock. He is coming in very fast. He is not slowing down." Miller checked her instruments. She could not maneuver. If she banked the heavy tanker too hard, the fuel in the wings would shift. It could destabilize the aircraft or cause a structural failure. She was a bird caught in a spotlight. "Hold your course," Miller said. "Do not give him a reason to think we are intimidated." Then, the radar warning receiver did something unexpected. It stopped the steady pulse. For 3 seconds, there was total silence in the cockpit. The co-pilot let out a breath. "Did he break lock?" the co-pilot asked. "No," Miller replied. She looked at the display. Her face went pale. "He did not break lock. He changed the frequency. It is a fire control lock. He is slaving a missile to our position." The silent cockpit was suddenly filled with a new sound. It was a low, rhythmic growl that vibrated through their headsets. It was the sound of a missile seeking a target. "He is not just looking anymore," the co-pilot whispered. "He is ready to kill us." 2:23 in the afternoon. The North Arabian Sea. 300 miles to the south, the deck of a United States aircraft carrier was a hive of controlled violence. The smell of burnt kerosene and sea salt hung heavy in the humid air. On catapult number 1, 2 F-14 Super Hornets strained against their holdbacks. The pilots were already strapped in. They had been sitting in Alert 5 status for 3 hours. Now, the order had finally come. The flight deck officer signaled the launch. A wall of steam erupted from the catapult track. The first fighter, call sign Raven 11, vanished into the haze as it was flung off the bow at 150 miles per hour. 3 seconds later, Raven 12 followed. They were banking north before their landing gear had even finished retracting. The lead pilot spoke to his wingman. "Raven 12, check in. 2 is up. Weapons hot. Master arm is on." "Copy," the lead pilot said. "Vectoring 010. Target is a hostile Tomcat locking a friendly tanker. We are going to full afterburner." Back inside the tanker, Captain Miller listened to the screaming tone of the fire control radar. It was a sound that signaled an imminent launch. She keyed the International Guard frequency. This was the open channel that every pilot and controller in the region was required to monitor. The captain spoke into her mask. "Iranian aircraft on bearing 350. This is Exxon 51. You are illuminating a non-combatant aircraft in international airspace. Your actions are hostile. Break off your intercept immediately, or you will be responsible for the consequences." There was no reply. Only the steady, rhythmic growl of the radar lock remained. Major Rezai heard the warning in his headset. He looked at his weapons systems officer. Did the Americans launch from the carrier? The officer checked the electronic warfare display. Confirmed. 2 fast movers just popped up on the southern horizon. They are climbing through 10,000 feet. They are coming for us. Rezai did not flinch. How long until they are in range of their missiles? 6 minutes, the officer replied. But we are already in range of ours. We can end this before they even see us on their own radar. The Iranian pilot felt the sweat cooling on his neck. He was caught in a tactical trap. If he turned away now, he would look weak. If he stayed, he would be forced into a dogfight with 2 superior fighters. But his orders were clear. He was to challenge the American presence. He was to show them that the Gulf was no longer their playground. The strategic situation was deteriorating by the second. In the Combined Air Operations Center in Qatar, senior officers watched the 2 blue icons of the F-14 fighters racing toward the single red icon of the Iranian Tomcat. Between them sat the yellow icon of the tanker. It was a slow-moving target that could not defend itself. A general spoke to the room. "What is the status of the tanker?" An analyst replied. "They are still being locked, sir. The Tomcat has not fired, but the pilot has his finger on the trigger. If he shoots, Exxon 51 is gone, before the Ravens can get there." The general looked at the clock. "Tell the Ravens to go supersonic. I want them to make a lot of noise. I want that Iranian pilot to know he is about to have a very bad day if he does not turn around." The 2 F-14 fighters pushed their throttles past the detent. The engines roared as the afterburners ignited. 2 massive plumes of orange flame pushed them through the sound barrier. A double sonic boom rolled across the water like a clap of thunder. The clock was ticking. Neither side was backing down. 2:28 in the afternoon. The central Persian Gulf. The alarm in the cockpit of the KC-135 was no longer just a sound. It was a physical pressure. Captain Miller felt the vibration in her teeth. The Iranian fighter was now less than 15 miles away. At his current speed, that represented less than 90 seconds of flight time. The situation was no longer a shadow dance of electronic signals. It was a physical confrontation in 3-dimensional space. Inside the 14 Tomcat, Major Rezai made his move. He pushed the nose of his heavy fighter down. He was no longer just flying a parallel track to the American tanker. He was intercepting. He was placing his aircraft on a collision course to force the Americans to react. "Range 12 miles, his backseat officer called out. His voice was strained. "Closing fast. The Americans are shouting on the radio again. They are threatening to fire. They say the F-18s are coming over the horizon." Rezai did not answer. He was focused on the green circle in his head-up display. He shifted his thumb to the weapon release button on the stick. He was not going to fire. Not yet. But he wanted the Americans to believe he was a heartbeat away from doing it. He wanted to see if their professional mask would slip. He wanted to see if they would break their formation and run. 60 miles to the south, the 2 F-18 fighters were a blur of gray against the blue water. The 2 F-18 fighters were a blur of gray against the blue water. They were pushing their engines to the limit. The heat from their afterburners distorted the air behind them for hundreds of meters. The lead pilot spoke to his wingman, Raven 1-1. "We have a solid track on the hostile. He is diving on the tanker, requesting permission to engage." The response from the aircraft carrier was immediate and cold. Raven 1-1. "This is strike. Negative. Do not fire. You are only authorized to defend the tanker if a missile is in the air. We cannot be the ones to start this war. Repeat. Do not fire unless fired upon." The pilot of Raven 1-1 gripped his flight stick until his knuckles were white inside his gloves. Strike. By then it will be too late. That tanker is a fireball if he pulls the trigger. Exxon 51 has no flares. They have no chaff. They are a sitting duck. The air was thick with the silent weight of the rules of engagement. In the world of modern aerial combat, the difference between a hero and a war criminal is often measured in a fraction of a second. Both sides were waiting for the other to blink. The Iranian pilot was counting on American restraint. The American pilots were praying for an Iranian mistake. Inside the tanker, the co-pilot looked at the primary flight display. He is accelerating. He just went through the sound barrier. A split second later, the shockwave of the Iranian jet hit them. The massive tanker shuddered. The windows rattled in their frames, like a giant fist had struck the side of the fuselage. The sound was a deafening crack that echoed through the cargo hold and into the cockpit. "He is coming in," the co-pilot yelled. "Brake left, Miller. We have to brake left." Captain Miller did not move the yoke. Her eyes were fixed on the horizon. "No. If we turn, we expose our belly. We show him our largest cross-section. We stay straight. We show him we are not moving. We are a sovereign aircraft in international space. We do not flinch." In the Combined Air Operations Center, the general stared at the big screen. The red and yellow dots were merging into one. "Define hostile intent," the general barked at his staff. A legal officer stood nearby. "Sir, a fire control lock is legally a hostile act in this sector. You have the authority to clear the Ravens for a shot right now." The general looked at the map. To the east were Iranian surface-to-air missile batteries. To the west were civilian oil tankers. One wrong move would change the map of the Middle East forever. He knew that the 48,000 kilograms of fuel in that tanker would burn for days. "Not yet," the general said. His voice was a whisper. "Tell the Ravens to put their noses on him. Let him see their radar on his own warning system. Let him know he is dead if he twitches." The two aircraft were now so close they could see each other. The standoff had reached its breaking point. 2:31 in the afternoon. Over the Central Gulf. Inside the cockpit of the American tanker, the sound of the radar warning receiver had reached a fever pitch. It was a rhythmic, piercing scream that signaled a missile was seconds from being launched. Captain Miller looked at her co-pilot. His hands were white as they gripped the flight controls. They were flying a massive target, and they were running out of sky. Captain Miller reached for a protected switch on the center pedestal. "We cannot stay heavy. If he hits us with 48,000 kilograms of fuel on board, the explosion will take out anything within 2 miles. We are going to emergency fuel jettison." The co-pilot nodded. He flipped the guard cover and hit the secondary switch. Jettison active. Valves are open. At the rear of the aircraft, 2 large nozzles began to spray raw jet fuel into the atmosphere. It emerged as a fine, white mist that trailed behind the tanker like a ghostly shroud. To an observer, it looked like the aircraft was bleeding. The fuel vaporized instantly in the freezing air, creating a massive cloud of volatile chemicals. It was a desperate move to reduce the explosive mass of the plane and gain a fraction of a percent in maneuverability. 5 miles behind them, Major Rezai saw the white cloud erupt from the American plane. He flinched and pulled back on his stick, thinking for a split second that the tanker had exploded or was deploying a chemical countermeasure. The major spoke to his officer in the back seat. "What is that? Did they just suffer a catastrophic failure?" The weapons systems officer checked his thermal sensors. "Negative. They are dumping fuel. They are trying to lighten the load, or they are trying to create a screen to hide their heat signature." Rezai felt a surge of adrenaline. The sight of the fuel spray made the situation feel real in a way the radar screens did not. He was looking at the lifeblood of the American air mission being dumped into the sea. To him, it looked like a surrender. "Close the distance," Rezai ordered. "I want to be close enough to see the pilot's face. If they want to dump their fuel, let them. It only makes them a smaller fireball." 10 miles to the south, the 2 F-14 fighters were now traveling at 1,000 miles per hour. The air around their wings was screaming. The pilots were breathing heavily into their masks, the high G-forces of their climb pressing them into their seats. The lead pilot of Raven 11 checked his tactical display. "I have the Tomcat. He is 5 miles from the tanker. He is sitting right in their wake. Strike, be advised, Exxon is dumping fuel. The air back there is highly volatile. If anyone fires a weapon, the whole sector is going to ignite." The controller on the aircraft carrier responded. "Copy that, Raven. Be advised, the Iranian pilot is now within the minimum abort range. If you do not intercede now, we lose the tanker." "We are coming in," the pilot replied. Raven 1-2, split high. "I will take the low line. We are going to sandwich him. Do not lock him yet, just get in his way." The 2 fighters banked in opposite directions, carving massive arcs in the sky. They were moving so fast that the world outside their cockpits was a blur of blue and gray. They were 3 minutes away from a collision that would change the world. Inside the tanker, Captain Miller watched the fuel gauges drop. Each 1,000 kilograms they lost made the plane feel a little lighter, a little more responsive, but it was not enough. The Iranian 14 was now so close that she could see the individual rivets on its nose. She could see the dark shape of the pilot in the cockpit. The Iranian jet moved alongside them. It was a terrifying sight. The massive swing-wing fighter hovered just 50 meters off their left wingtip. It was close enough that the turbulence from its engines caused the tanker to roll violently to the right. The co-pilot fought the controls. "He is right there. He is right on our wing." Miller looked to her left. She locked eyes with the Iranian pilot for a fraction of a second. Miller looked to her left. She saw the gray helmet and the dark visor. She saw the professional, steady hands on the controls. This was no longer about technology or politics. It was about two people in a high-stakes game of chicken. The Iranian pilot slowly raised his hand. He pointed toward the northern horizon. It was a clear command: turn around or die. The morning was over. The crisis had reached its peak. 2:34 in the afternoon. The central Persian Gulf. The massive KC-135 tanker groaned under the strain of the wake turbulence. The Iranian 14 was so close that its wingtip was nearly overlapping the tanker's fuel boom. Inside the cockpit, Captain Miller fought to keep the wings level. The aircraft was vibrating with a violent, rhythmic shudder. The co-pilot shouted over the noise. "He is moving to the underside. He is trying to get into our blind spot. Keep your eyes on him," Miller said. Her voice was a low growl. "Do not let him surprise us." Inside the 14, Major Rezai was focused. He could see the individual rivets on the belly of the American plane. He could see the white mist of the fuel jettison spraying just meters away from his engines. It was a dangerous environment. A single spark from his afterburners could ignite the sky. The radio in his ear crackled. It was the command center at Bandar Abbas. The voice was urgent. "Major, the American fighters are within 20 miles. You are authorized to engage the tanker if the fighters cross the line. Do not let them protect the intruder." Rezai shifted his hand. He flipped the master arm switch to the armed position. A red light illuminated on his dashboard. It was the color of blood. In his head-up display, the targeting box turned from a dashed line to a solid square. The missile was slaved. The seeker head was locked on the heat of the tanker's engines. 2:34 and 30 seconds in the afternoon. 10 miles away, the lead F-18 pilot saw the thermal spike on his sensors. Raven 1-1. Hostile Tomcat has gone hot. Repeat. He is hot. I have a shoot cue. Requesting permission to fire. The voice from the carrier was breathless. Wait. Wait for the signal. The pilot of Raven 1-1 ignored the command. He banked his fighter into a sharp 6G turn. He was coming in from the sun. He wanted to be the last thing the Iranian pilot saw. He pushed his throttle to the wall. The sonic boom hit the water below like a physical strike. Inside the tanker, the alarm changed again. It was no longer a pulse. It was a continuous, flat tone. It was the sound of a death sentence. "He has a launch lock," the co-pilot screamed. "Miller, he is going to shoot." Captain Miller looked at the master caution light. She looked at the fuel gauges. She looked at the photo of her family taped to the instrument panel. She did not close her eyes. 2:35 in the afternoon. Major Rezai felt his heartbeat in his fingertips. The trigger was a cold piece of metal against his glove. He began to squeeze. He saw the American fighters appearing as two silver flashes on his left. They were closing at Mach 1.5. They would kill him. But he would kill the tanker first. The entire Gulf seemed to hold its breath. Thousands of people on ships and in command centers watched the three dots on their screens. The history of the next decade was balanced on a single millimeter of trigger pull. The sound of the radar lock filled every headset. It was a wall of noise that drowned out the world. 2:35 in the afternoon. The central Persian Gulf. The trigger was halfway through its travel. Major Rezai felt the resistance of the metal against his glove. In his head-up display, the green box was flashing. The computer was screaming for him to fire. The American tanker was a massive wall of heat in his sensors. the two F-18 fighters were seconds away from his 6 o'clock. Then, the International Guard frequency did not carry a threat. It carried a scream. The voice was not military. It was high-pitched and frantic. It was the sound of a human being in total terror. Mayday! 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 This is the motor vessel Marjan Star. We have a catastrophic explosion in the engine room. We are losing power. We are on fire. And we are sinking. Any vessel in the area, please. We have 40 crew on board. Major Rezai flinched. The sudden intrusion of a civilian emergency into his kill chain was like a bucket of ice water. He looked down through the floor of his cockpit. 5,000 feet below the aerial standoff, a massive red-hulled oil tanker was venting a column of oily black smoke. A secondary explosion ripped through the midsection of the ship. A fountain of orange flame shot 300 feet into the air. The thermal bloom was so intense that it washed out the infrared sensors on Rezai's missiles. The green tracking box in his display began to flicker and dance. It could no longer distinguish between the American tanker's engines and the inferno on the water. Inside the American tanker, the screaming radar warning suddenly went silent. The co-pilot looked at his display in confusion. He broke lock. The lock is gone. Captain Miller did not look at her instruments. She looked down at the ocean. The black smoke from the Marjan Star was rising like a wall between them and the Iranian coast. Look at the water. My God, that ship just blew apart. 2:36 in the afternoon. The two F-18 fighters, Raven 1-1 and Raven 1-2, came screaming over the top of the tanker. They were prepared to engage the Iranian Tomcat. But as they crested the altitude of the tanker, their sensors were overwhelmed by the heat from below. The pilot of Raven 1-1 spoke to his wingman. 2. Do you see that? We have a massive thermal event at sea level. It looks like a civilian tanker. It is breaking up. Copy, Raven 1-2 replied. I see it. The Tomcat is breaking away. He is diving toward the wreck. Major Rezai had pulled his throttles back to idle. He banked his F-14 into a steep, descending spiral. He was no longer looking at the American tanker. He was looking at the orange life rafts being launched into a sea of burning oil. The major spoke to his backseat officer. Contact Bandar Abbas. Tell them we have a civilian disaster. We need search and rescue helicopters immediately. Forget the Americans. There are people in the water. The transition was instantaneous. The air of the Persian Gulf, which had been seconds away from a storm of missiles and fire, was suddenly filled with a different kind of urgency. The hunters and the prey were now observers to a tragedy that transcended borders. Inside the KC-135, Captain Miller leveled her wings. The emergency fuel jettison was still active, spraying a white mist into the air. She reached over and flipped the switch to close. Exxon 5-1 to all stations, Miller said. Her voice was steady, but the adrenaline was still humming in her blood. We are on station at 24,000 feet. We have a clear view of the Marjan Star. We are staying on scene to act as a radio relay. Does anyone have contact with the survivors? The Iranian pilot, now circling at 3,000 feet, heard the American woman's voice. He looked up at the white silhouette of the tanker high above him. A minute ago, he was prepared to turn her into a cloud of ash. Now, her aircraft was the only thing capable of reaching a radio tower with news of the sinking ship. The standoff had vanished. The pivot was complete. 2:37 in the afternoon. This is Major Rezai of the Iranian Air Force, the pilot said. He spoke on the open frequency for the first time. He did not use a call sign. Exxon 5-1. I am over the debris field. I see 20 men in the water. They are surrounded by burning oil. I am low on fuel. I can only stay for 10 minutes. Captain Miller gripped the radio. Copy, Major. We see you. We are relaying your coordinates to the carrier and to Qatar. Help is coming. Just hold on. The two F-18 fighters slowed down and began a protective orbit around the entire scene. They were no longer targets. They were no longer enemies. They were the only witnesses to a rescue that should have been a massacre. 2:38 in the afternoon. The central Persian Gulf. The scene on the water was a vision of hell. The Marjan Star had broken in two. The bow was pointing toward the sky like a jagged tooth, while the stern was already submerged. A lake of burning crude oil spread across the surface, creating a barrier of fire between the survivors and the open sea. The black smoke rose in a towering column that could be seen for 50 miles. Major Rezai was flying at 500 feet. The heat from the fire below was so intense he could feel it through the floor of his cockpit. He saw men clinging to pieces of wreckage. Some were swimming toward a small patch of clear water, away from the encroaching flames. The smell of burning oil and salt water began to seep into his oxygen system. The Major keyed his radio. Exxon 5-1. I see them. They are trapped by the fire. We need a path for a rescue boat. I do not see any Iranian Coast Guard vessels within 20 miles. My radar shows nothing but small fishing boats. 2:42 in the afternoon. Inside the KC-135, Captain Miller was working 3 radios at once. Qatar Center, Exxon 5-1. Miller said, "We have a civilian disaster. Confirming coordinates. We need a search and rescue helicopter now. The nearest Iranian assets are too far. What is the status of the American carrier?" The voice of the general in Qatar came through, clear and authoritative. "Exxon, we have a Seahawk helicopter launched from the carrier. It is 10 minutes out, but we have a problem. They are entering Iranian-claimed waters. We need a guarantee of safe passage. We cannot send them into a trap." Miller didn't hesitate. She switched to the frequency she had used with the F-14. "Major Rezai, this is Exxon. We have an American rescue helicopter 10 minutes away. They need to enter this zone to save those men. Can you guarantee they will not be targeted by your surface-to-air batteries?" 2:46 in the afternoon. There was a long silence. Major Rezai looked at his fuel gauge. He had less than 15 minutes of flight time remaining before he would be forced to glide back to Bandar Abbas. He looked at the men in the water. One of them was waving a white cloth. The fire was closing in on them. "Exxon," Rezai said. His voice was tired. "I am the senior officer on site. I am declaring this a humanitarian zone. Tell your helicopter to come. I will escort them. I am staying until the first survivor is hoisted." The 2 F-18 fighters, Raven 1-1 and Raven 1-2, slowed their orbits. They stayed at 10,000 feet, watching the Tomcat below. The tension was still there, but it had changed shape. It was no longer the tension of a predator and prey. It was the tension of a shared burden. Raven 1-1 to the Tomcat, the American fighter pilot said. "We have your back, Major. We are staying high. We will not lock you. We are just watching the perimeter for any other interference." "Copy, Raven," Rezai replied. "I am at bingo fuel in 4 minutes. If your helicopter is not here by then, I must leave. I am pushing my luck with every orbit." 2:50 in the afternoon, a low-frequency thumping sound began to echo across the water. A SH-60 Seahawk helicopter appeared on the southern horizon, kicking up a spray of salt water as it flew at 50 feet. It moved toward the burning wreck with a singular purpose. The rescue swimmer was already positioned at the open side door. The Iranian F-14 circled the helicopter once. It was a silent salute between 2 professionals who had been ready to kill each other 10 minutes ago. The American helicopter pilot nodded through the glass, a brief acknowledgement of the escort. "He is out of fuel," the co-pilot of the tanker said, watching the F-14 turn toward the north. "He is heading home. Look at his climb. He is nursing those engines." Captain Miller watched the Tomcat disappear into the haze over the Iranian coast. He stayed as long as he could. He did his job. The tanker remained high above, a silent sentinel over the rescue. Below them, the first survivor was lifted from the water. The crisis of war had been replaced by a fight for life. The afternoon was fading. The danger was not over, but the fire in the sky had been extinguished. 2:52 in the afternoon. Over the southern Persian Gulf, the American Seahawk helicopter, call sign Rescue 1, was hovering 30 feet above the churning water. The downwash from its rotors pushed against the thick black smoke, creating a temporary pocket of clear air. Below, the rescue swimmer was a small splash of orange in a sea of dark oil. He was pulling the first survivor toward the rescue basket. Inside the KC-135, Captain Miller watched the scene through her side window. The massive tanker was circling at 20,000 feet. She was now the primary communication link for the entire operation. Without her altitude, the low-flying helicopter would be unable to talk to the carrier or the medical teams in Qatar. Rescue 1, this is Exxon 5-1, Miller said. We have you loud and clear. Be advised, the Iranian Tomcat has exited the area. You are currently the only aircraft at low altitude. How is the survivor count? The helicopter pilot's voice was strained by the noise of the rotors. Exxon, we have 3 on board. We have another 15 in the water. The fire is spreading. We are going to need a second lift. Tell the carrier we need Rescue 2 on the way. Miller switched to the command frequency. Qatar Center. Exxon 5-1. Rescue 1 requests immediate launch of the backup bird. The situation on the water is deteriorating. 3 o'clock in the afternoon. Bandar Abbas Air Base, Iran. Major Rezai felt the heavy jolt of his landing gear hitting the runway. He was flying on fumes. As he taxied his F-14 toward the hardened hangar, his engines began to cough. He shut them down before he even reached the parking spot. The silence that followed was deafening. He climbed out of the cockpit and stood on the wing. His flight suit was soaked in sweat. Across the tarmac, a group of senior officers was waiting for him. They were not smiling. One of them held a transcript of the radio communications. The colonel looked up at Rezai. You allowed an American helicopter to operate 5 miles inside our territorial waters. You gave them an escort. Rezai took off his helmet. His face was lined with exhaustion. There were 20 Iranian sailors in that water, Colonel. The Americans had the only helicopter, close enough to save them. If I had fired, those men would be dead, and we would be at war with 2 carrier wings. The colonel stared at him for a long time. The tension was thick. Finally, the older man looked at the ground. The Ministry of Foreign Affairs is already drafting a statement. They are calling it a coordinated rescue. For now, you are a hero. Do not make me regret it. 3:10 in the afternoon. High above the Gulf. The 2 F-18 fighters, Raven 1-1 and Raven 1-2, were finally feeling the effects of their high-speed dash. Their fuel displays were amber. They had spent their combat reserves to protect a tanker that was now helping their enemies. The lead pilot keyed his radio. Exxon 5-1, we are low. We need to plug in before we head back to the boat. Are your booms clear? Captain Miller looked at her co-pilot. They had dumped thousands of kilograms of fuel earlier to lighten the plane. They had just enough left to get the fighters home and reach their own landing strip. Ravens, this is Exxon, Miller replied. Booms are down. Come and get it. We are staying on station until the second helicopter arrives. Then we are all going home. The 2 gray fighters glided into position behind the tanker. It was a delicate dance of metal and precision. The refueling probes connected with a metallic clink. For the next 5 minutes, the 3 aircraft flew as one. The sun was beginning to drop toward the horizon, casting long, golden shadows across the wings of the planes. The threat of a missile strike had passed. The radar warning receivers were silent. The only sound in the headsets was the steady breathing of the pilots and the hiss of the wind. 3:15 in the afternoon. Fuel transfer complete, Raven 1-1 said. Thanks for the gas, Exxon. And thanks for holding the line. That was a close one. Miller watched the fighters bank away. Anytime, Raven. See you back at the base. The tanker was now alone in the high sky. Below them, the second rescue helicopter had arrived. The survivors were being lifted, one by one, out of the burning sea. The crisis was de-escalating, but the memory of the fire control lock was still fresh in Miller's mind. She knew that the line between a rescue and a massacre was thinner than a coat of paint. The sky was turning orange. The mission was almost over. 3:20 in the afternoon. The central Persian Gulf. The sea was a graveyard of black ash and twisted metal. The last rescue basket from the second American helicopter, Rescue 2, was pulled into the cabin. Below, the remains of the Marjan Star had finally vanished beneath the waves. Only a thick, oily slick remained to mark the spot where a $100 million vessel had sat 10 minutes prior. Inside the KC-135, the silence was heavy. The high-pitched scream of the radar warning receiver was a ghost of a sound, still echoing in the pilot's ears, even though the equipment was now quiet. Captain Miller looked at her co-pilot. His flight suit was stained with sweat, and his eyes were fixed on the navigation screen. There was no cheering. There was no sense of victory. There was only the bone-deep fatigue that follows a near-death experience. Rescue 2 to Exxon 5-1. The helicopter pilot said, "We have the final 5 survivors on board. Total count is 40 souls. We are heading back to the carrier. Thanks for the overwatch, Exxon. We could not have done it without your radio relay." Miller keyed her mic. "Copy. Rescue 2. Glad you got them. We are heading for the barn. Safe flight." 3:45 in the afternoon. The tanker was now 200 miles from the site of the intercept. They were flying south, away from the Iranian coast and toward the safety of Al Udeid Air Base in Qatar. The sun was lower now, turning the cockpit into a chamber of amber light. Captain Miller adjusted her visor. She checked the fuel gauges one last time. They were sitting on 8,000 kilograms. It was enough to get home with a small reserve, but the emergency dump had left them with very little margin for error. "Check the hydraulics," Miller said. Her voice was scratchy. The co-pilot moved his hand across the panel. "Pressures are normal. Flight controls are responsive. The airframe seems fine. That Tomcat's wake turbulence gave us a hell of a shake, but we are holding together." Miller nodded. She thought about the Iranian pilot, Major Rezai. She wondered what was happening to him on the other side of that invisible line in the sand. They had shared a moment of absolute clarity, a moment where the machines of war were paused by the reality of human suffering. She knew that in any other hour, on any other day, he would have pulled that trigger. 4 o'clock in the afternoon. The tanker crossed the invisible boundary into the Qatar Flight Information Region. The tension in the cockpit finally began to evaporate, replaced by the mundane tasks of landing a heavy aircraft. They began their descent from 24,000 feet. In the Combined Air Operations Center, the general watched the yellow icon of Exxon 5-1 merge with the approach path for the airbase. He turned to his staff. "I want the sensor data from that tanker downloaded the second they touch the tarmac. I want to see exactly when that fire control lock was initiated, and I want a full report on the civilian vessel's explosion." "Sir," an aide said, "the Iranians have already released a statement. They are thanking the international partners for the rescue. They are not mentioning the intercept." The general leaned back in his chair. "Of course they aren't. We almost started World War III over a border dispute, and then we saved 40 of their sailors. Nobody wants to explain that to the press." Inside the tanker, the landing gear cycled down with a heavy thud. The green lights on the dashboard illuminated. Captain Miller gripped the yoke for the final approach. "Flaps 30, Miller said. "Flaps 30, the co-pilot repeated. The heavy aircraft touched down on the sun-baked runway. The tires screeched as they met the concrete. Miller pulled the thrust reversers, the engines roaring as they slowed the 40-ton aircraft. They taxied toward the parking ramp where a maintenance crew was already waiting. As the engines finally wound down into a high-pitched whine and then silence, Miller sat still for a moment. She took off her headset and felt the weight of the day settle into her shoulders. "We are home," the co-pilot said. He sounded like he was talking to himself. "We are," Miller replied. "But the world is a very different place than it was this morning. The crisis was over. The aftermath was just beginning." 7:30 in the evening. Al Udeid Air Base, Qatar. The debriefing room was small, windowless, and smelled of stale coffee and ozone. Captain Miller sat at a metal table, her flight suit still damp at the collar. Across from her, 2 intelligence officers in pressed desert camouflaged uniforms stared at a glowing monitor. They were replaying the sensor data from Exxon 5-1. The senior officer, a major with tired eyes, paused the video. The screen showed a jagged green line representing the Iranian radar frequency. "Right here," the major said. At 2:34 and 40 seconds, the frequency shifts to a high pulse repetition. That is the exact moment his fire control computer calculated a terminal solution. Captain, if he had squeezed that trigger, how much time would you have had? Miller looked at the frozen green line. 0, she said. Her voice was flat. At that range, with a Phoenix missile, we would have been a cloud of vapor before the alarm even registered in our headsets. The major nodded slowly. Our analysts have confirmed the thermal bloom from the Marjan Star explosion. It was massive. It created a blind spot in the infrared spectrum for exactly 12 seconds. That was the window. That was why he broke the lock. He lost the contrast he needed for a clean kill. He didn't just lose the lock, sir, Miller interrupted. He chose to look down. He saw the ship. He chose to prioritize the rescue over the engagement. The major closed the laptop. The official report will state that technical interference caused by a civilian industrial accident forced a de-escalation of the intercept. Washington and Tehran have already agreed on the narrative. No one wants to admit how close we came to a general war over a refueling track. 8:15 in the evening. A secure military facility near Bandar Abbas. Major Rezai sat in a high-backed wooden chair. A single lamp on the desk cast long shadows against the concrete walls. He was holding a glass of cold tea, but he had not taken a sip. In front of him sat the flight data recorder from his F-14. The colonel, who had met him on the tarmac, stood by the window. The survivors from the Marjan Star are being treated at the Naval Hospital. The American helicopter dropped them at a coordinate where our patrol boats could reach them. 3 of the men are the sons of high-ranking officials in the Ministry of Interior. Rezai looked up. Does that change my standing, Colonel? It makes you a hero of the state, the colonel replied. It also makes you a lucky man. If you had fired a second before that ship exploded, you would be the man who started a war we cannot win. Instead, you are the man who showed restraint and saved our citizens. Rezai set the tea down. I did not feel like a hero. I felt like a man holding a lightning bolt. I could feel the heat of the American fighters on my back. They were going to kill me, Colonel. They were within 5 seconds of a firing solution when I broke away. The colonel turned from the window. The Americans are professional. They followed your lead. When you turned to save the drowning, they stayed to watch your back. It is a rare thing in this world, mutual respect between enemies. 10 o'clock in the evening, the Pentagon, Washington, D.C. A secure phone line buzzed in a quiet office. A high-ranking diplomat picked up the receiver. Is the statement ready? Yes, sir, a voice replied. Both sides have signed off. We are calling it a unfortunate mechanical failure on a civilian vessel that led to an impromptu humanitarian cooperation. The intercept of the tanker will be classified for the next 50 years. The diplomat looked out the window at the lights of the city. 48,000 kilograms of fuel. If that had gone up, the environmental damage alone would have closed the Strait of Hormuz for a month. Not to mention the body bags. The crisis is over, sir, the voice said. The crisis is over, the diplomat repeated. But the border is still there, and tomorrow we will fly the same track again. The records were filed. The data was encrypted. The world moved on to the next headline. But for the crews in the sky, the memory of the fire control lock would never truly fade. 9 o'clock in the morning, 3 days later. The Pentagon, a group of high-ranking analysts, sat around a conference table in a secure room deep within the building. On the wall, a satellite image showed the Persian Gulf. A small, dark circle on the water marked the location where the Marjan Star had gone down. Beside it, the digital flight paths of the Iranian 14 and the American KC-135 were overlaid in red and blue. One analyst pointed to the screen. The tactical data is clear. Major Rezai had a lock for 14 seconds. He was within the parameters for a high-probability kill. If he had fired, the tanker would have been lost before the F-18s could respond. The escalation would have been immediate. We estimate a 90% chance of a full theater conflict within 12 hours of that impact. A general at the end of the table leaned forward. And the reason he did not? The analyst sighed. Official reports say the explosion of the civilian ship interfered with the radar, but the telemetry shows he had already begun to ease off the trigger 2 seconds before the thermal bloom occurred. He hesitated. He saw the tanker was not maneuvering aggressively. He saw the civilian ship caught in the crossfire. He chose the human element over the tactical one. 11:30 in the morning. Bandar Abbas Air Base. Major Rezai stood on the balcony of the officers' club, looking out over the runway. The heat was already beginning to rise from the concrete. In the distance, he could see the silhouette of another F-14 being prepped for a mission. His own aircraft was in the hangar, receiving a deep-level inspection of its radar and engine systems after the high-stress encounter. A younger pilot walked up beside him. "The survivors are calling you a savior, Major. They say the American helicopter would never have come if you had not stayed to guide them." Rezai did not look at the younger man. "I am not a savior. I am a soldier. I did what was necessary to protect the people of this region. The Americans did the same. We were both looking for a reason to fight. We found a better reason to stop." 2:15 in the afternoon, over the central Persian Gulf. The sky was once again a deep and empty blue. At 24,000 feet, another KC-135 tanker flew the same refueling track. The pilot was not Captain Miller, but the mission was identical. Below, the water was calm. The oil slick from the Marjan Star had been broken up by the currents, leaving only a faint shimmer on the surface. In the distance, the radar warning receiver gave a single, short chirp. It was a search radar from the coast. A routine handshake. Captain Miller sat in the squadron ready room at Al Udeid, watching the live feed of the mission. She held a cold bottle of water in her hand. Her flight suit was clean, her gear stowed. She looked at the screen and thought about the face behind the dark visor of that F-14. She spoke to her co-pilot, who was sitting nearby. "Do you think they will change the tracks?" The co-pilot shook his head. "No. The diplomats say the lines stay where they are. They say moving them would be a sign of weakness. We will be back out there in 48 hours. Miller nodded. She understood the logic of the high-stakes game. The world was built on these invisible lines, and the people who flew them were the ones who kept the balance. 48,000 kilograms of fuel, Miller whispered, and it all came down to one man looking out a window. The strategic assessment would later show that the incident was a turning point in regional communication. A new direct line was established between the search and rescue centers in Qatar and Iran. It was a small bridge built over a chasm of distrust. No missiles had flown. No ships had been lost to combat. But the history of the Gulf had shifted. When the line was crossed, both sides chose restraint over glory. Modern warfare is often defined by the noise of explosions and the speed of technology. But on this day, it was decided by who chose not to fire at all. The morning was over. The sky remained quiet. For now, the peace of the Persian Gulf held firm.